My name is Khaled Mattawa. I'm from the English department, and I'd like to welcome you to this distinguished panel for an event titled Milosz, Made in America. It's a combination of the annual Copernicus lecture and a reading in the Zell Visiting Writers series. From the mid-1970s till the early 90s, three Nobel Prize winners, or maybe future Nobel Prize winners, some affiliated, or not affiliated, but associated with the Cold War, lived in the United States. Maybe on the radio this afternoon you heard about Alexander Solzhenitsyn, a new book by him. He came to the United States, very much a Cold Warrior of sorts, and did not endear himself to the United States, hectored people at Harvard for American materialism, and lived in Vermont in a big country house surrounded by barbed wire, and then left. Joseph Brodsky came to live in the United States, already famous before coming here, supported by Jean-Paul Sartre and Auden. Very much a Cold War case, despite with all the talent involved. Became so American that he supported the Vietnam War and also the war in Central America. More American than Americans were comfortable with being American. And then Milosz, who had come to the United States before both Solzhenitsyn and Brodsky, had written a seminal book called The Captive Mind, a book that William F. Buckley used to like quoting. Not that Milosz enjoyed that association. And lived sort of a quiet, meditative life, and not a very splashy existence in the United States. He won the Nobel in 1980, but his first book in the United States, I believe, had come in 1977. And despite that sort of quiet presence, he's been perhaps the most influential international poet on American poetry after World War II. So much of what we know about him as a poet, as an international poet, much of his writing, he lived in the United States from about 1961 till 2004, or perhaps, in the United States. Half of his life was in America, his writing in America. So Milosz, Made in America. Much to talk about and much to think about, as the film had already suggested. To help us appreciate Milosz at his centennial is a distinguished panel, starting with Robert Haas, Poet Laureate of the United States, a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. Haas has also co-translated several volumes of poetry with Mieszko Milosz, including Facing the River and Second Space, and served as Poet Laureate of the United States, as I said, in 1995 to 1997. He teaches at the University of California, Berkeley. Robert Pinsky, the author of several collections of poetry and prose, and the first digital novel. Yes. He's also the translator, co-translator of César Milosz, The Separate Notebooks, and The Inferno of Dante, Poet Laureate of the United States from 1997 to 2002. No, to 2000, not 2002. Also, Lilian Vallée was born to Polish parents displaced by World War II, grew up in Detroit. She earned her PhD at the University of California, Berkeley, where she wrote her dissertation about Milosz writings and worked as his translator. She's translated several books from Polish, including Milosz's Bells in Winter and Adam Zagajewski's Two Cities on Exile, History, and Imagination. Professor Bogdana Carpenter is Professor Emeritus here at the University of Michigan. She is teaches Polish literature and languages. She is the author of The Poetic Avant-Garde in Poland and Monumenta Polanica, the first 4 centuries of Polish poetry. She is the translator, co-translator of several volumes of poetry and essays by Zbigniew Herbert and Julia Hartwig. And finally, is Benjamin Peloff. He's the author of a new book of poetry called The Politics, and translated several books from Polish, most recently selected poems of Andrzej Sosnowski, the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts and the U.S. Fulbright Program. He edits poetry and criticism for the Boston Review, and he will be moderating our panel, and I will turn the proceedings over to him. Thank you for coming, and enjoy our conversation. Thanks.
I like exercises and sharing. My name is Benjamin Peloff. I've already warned our distinguished guests that this evening's conversation will be conducted similarly to the method of James Lipton on Inside the Actors Studio, maybe without the overemphasis of awkward adjectives, but I will do my best to keep my own interventions limited. What the idea is that we're going to, in a sense, reminisce and give greater shape to our sense of Miłosz's career and life, especially, I think, his life in North America, including his influence and interaction with American letters. Starting in 1960, Miłosz writes that he arrived in Berkeley and started teaching, I believe, the following day after a hiatus from the United States of about 10 years. One of his first graduate students at Berkeley was Bogdana Carpenter. So what was it you encountered when you arrived in Berkeley?
Well, I didn't arrive in 1961. I arrived 4 years later, in 1965, to start my graduate work in the comparative literature. But before I even went to the comparative literature department, I knew that the mysterious, mythical, great Polish poet Miłosz was in Berkeley. So I wanted his class to be my first one. Well, what I encountered, I think once before told about the story, how I went to Dwinell Hall in Berkeley to look for his class. It was the beginning of the semester. It's a labyrinthian structure, so I couldn't find it. I was completely lost. There was no one, everybody was already in the classroom, empty corridors, me in a panic on high French heels. I just arrived from Paris, and making horrible noise, horrible ruckus. And then I saw a man before me, and because of the noise I made, he turned his head. All I saw were these bright blue eyes under very bushy eyebrows, and I knew I was on the right path. I just followed the man to the classroom, and that was it. Well, Miłosz was a wonderful teacher, and I just can say in a few words, I already wrote about it, I talked about it, but what really I particularly loved were two things. One, that although this was a course in survey of Polish literature, I learned more about various philosophers, about various religious sects, about foreign poets than maybe about Polish literature that I already knew something about. But the most impressive thing was that for Miłosz, literature, no matter from which period, whether it was contemporary or 5 centuries before, was something that was still alive. So he was very much a dialogical person. He needed a dialogue. He not only talked to us and needed our reaction, but he talked to those writers and poets from the past, sometimes contemporary, but sometimes from the 16th or 17th century. He argued with them just in front of us. Well, I've never had a teacher like that before. So this was the first impression as a teacher. And then slowly but surely we became friends. But it took some time. Milosz was aloof and a little bit suspicious of a young person from Poland in Berkeley.
I wonder if we could actually recount, if possible, those first encounters and first impressions more or less chronologically. I think Lillian would be next, if I'm not mistaken.
Probably would, 1971. Unlike Bogdana, I knew absolutely nothing about Czesław Miłosz. As a matter of fact, I found a note the other day that I had written to him, and his name was spelled Miłosz, which is the Polish word for love. And so I knew nothing about him, but in the survey classes, just as Bogdana has described, there was a tremendous passion and a sense of commitment, private obligation to this literature. And since I had come looking, I grew up in Detroit. My parents were Polish forced laborers in Hamburg during the war. I had come looking for something else. I had come looking for a tribal elder, I think, now when I think about it. And I can't say that he really liked that role, but he picked up on the interest immediately, and he was not a self-promoter in the classroom, so he wasn't promoting himself or his work. But I did come across his work in the library, and the book that became absolutely passionate reading, and for which I neglected many of my other classes, was Native Realm, which was a search for self-definition, as he described it. But it was as if I could get the history that I was missing in this book, and I would go back and read it and reread it and reread it, not really understanding exactly why, and slowly began to piece together a missing piece of my identity. And I was there when, ironically, his stock began to rise because of the Dostoevsky classes, the irony of that. One of the reasons he was so interested in English literature and went at it with such a passion in the post-war period when he was an attaché was that he thought he could create a counterweight to works that he thought would be being translated into Russian in Poland. And so he thought if he could translate enough English literature, he could create, it was a strategic move, he could create this counterweight. And so he was very interested because I was coming out of English literature. But in the Dostoevsky class, I suddenly had a gigantic audience. And some of the Polish survey classes had 6 people, 7 people. And he was quite often disappointed. Most of those people were graduate students who needed that second language, the way you saw described in the film. And the Dostoevsky classes suddenly gave him a larger audience, and I think suddenly began to attract people from other disciplines to his courses. There was a funny incident that you might like in the Dostoevsky class. One day a dog came in and began to bark at him while he was lecturing about Dostoevsky, and just barked ferociously, and I thought, oh, it's all over. You know, everybody's distracted. And he looked at the dog and he smiled and he said, sometimes the devil takes the form of a dog. So what I loved about the classes and what I thought was really important was the multidisciplinary approach that I have used since then in my in my own teaching, a sense of commitment. It was also a sense, there was also a feeling very different than what you have in the film. The film, he's looking back, it's post-Neustadt Award, post-Nobel. In the period that I knew him, he thought he had lost. He thought he was defeated. And so, beautifully enough, though, there was a sweetness and a tenderness towards himself and towards other people, because that was all that was left. So the beauty of that period was that he was very open, very honest about his failings. As a matter of fact, one of the poems that Robert Pinsky has translated is one of my favorite ones that begins, "The history of my stupidity would fill many volumes." That was the tenor, and so he was wonderful with young people, open about his deficiencies, made himself very vulnerable, and that was a big lesson to me in how you teach people as well.
So I guess in chronological order, I'm next. I knew of Czeslav's work because I read The Captive Mind in college. One of the things that the film did not get right would convey the impression, those of you who haven't read it, that The Captive Mind is a book of Cold War polemics. It's a work of art, and it's one of the great books about politics and literature and the 20th century. And it's riveting reading. It's an amazing and very powerful book. And I certainly didn't read it as Cold War polemic. Anyway, I was aware of the book, and one of my best friends, my best friend from grammar school, went on to do graduate work in Russian at Berkeley, and Milosz pounced on him right away, as he did on all the good students, and stole them away from Russian to study Polish. And so I had heard lots of anecdotes about Czeslaw from my friend, but he seemed, I would see him around Berkeley from time to time. He seemed like a rather forbidding presence to me. And then I heard that a book of his poems was circulating and couldn't get published. The wonderful book that Lillian and Czeslaw translated together, Bells in Winter. And I called, was Robertson my common editor, and said, "There's this book. The guy's supposed to be a great poet." And they ended up publishing the book, and then he came out to Berkeley in 77. What year was Bells in Winter published? It would have been?
It was actually later, 78.
78, so it was 77. The book had been taken but not published, and I met Czeslaw at that point. And I didn't understand his loneliness. I thought he was, and he called me a few days later and said that he was giving a poetry reading in San Francisco at a big international festival, and he didn't like to read his poems in English. Would I read the poems in English, and he would read them in Polish? What I thought was a little bit odd, because he was, as you could hear, his accent was, he could certainly make himself understood, and I think it was, he wanted contact with people. But I was mainly worried, he was going to come over to my house, and I was mainly worried with what I should serve him, so I went to find out I went to the local store and said, "What's the best beer in the world?" And he said, I think they said, what's the Czech beer? It was Budvar. Yeah, and so I got some and brought it back, and it was a hot day, and I said casually, "Would you like a beer?" And I produced it, and he said, "Good beer," and I thought I'd made it with him. Then later, over the years, when he came to the house, he would always say to my wife, "Vodka Brenda," the first thing we came in the door. We kept it in the refrigerator for him. It wasn't true that he only drank bourbon in Berkeley. Anyway, he came over, we sat down and started looking at the poems he was to read, that I was to read in English, and Richard talked about his being like a child in some way. We had gone through 2 or 3 of them, and he said to me, "You don't say what you think of the poems." And we'd been talking about them for all this time, and he hadn't received any praise, and he wanted it. And I forget what I said, but something like, "Well, I don't know what to say about the poems. I don't read Polish. The translations are the work of a very intelligent man." And he said, "You don't like them." And I said, as I said, I don't know the poems. The translations these are the translations of the poems in the selected volume, not Lillian's amazing translations. I said, they're a little stiff. And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Well, I don't know what the level of diction is in the Polish. In the English, you want to say this naturally and forcefully, you maybe say it this way." And he said, "Well, what about this?" And we sat down, and then we did it for 30 years. That was how I came to begin to work with him. And then shortly after, well, I should pass the baton, because shortly after, Robert moved to town.
I moved from Massachusetts to Berkeley to teach at Berkeley. I guess it was 1979, and I'd been immensely impressed by Bells in Winter, the book that Lillian translated with Czesław, and my memory of the working together, what Czesław wanted to call the Grizzly Peak Collaborative. At one point he wanted to invent a translator, somebody named Grizzly Peak. That would really be Bob, Bernarda Gorczynski, Czesław, and me, and then we wouldn't have to keep track of who did what in which poem. I hesitate a little bit. I'm going to say the first time I had a tete-a-tete with him, we had agreed, because I hope you understand how it's related to what Lillian said about his having accepted failure. And in that poem that is so prominent in the film, he says, "I'll never wear a tiara, I'll never wear a crown." A moment that was very striking to me in the film, something I never heard him say before, that's very consistent with The Captive Mind, and very consistent with what you say, is he was describing his agony and despair in the post-war period when he was an attaché at the embassy. And he said, it was right after this, he says, "I wanted to do a menial job, anything to get away from politics." He would rather drive a cab than have to be either in the context of American capitalist politics, anti-communist politics, or Sovietized Polish politics. He would rather be a waiter or drive a cab. And he said an amazing, extraordinary thing for anybody to say, in a way. He said, if I went back, if I stayed, I probably would have gradually given in. I would have given in, and I would have started to just keep to the socialist realist aesthetic, which is the process he describes in The Captive Mind. And his introspection and candor are so deep that he can say, if I'd done that, I probably would have given, I would have knuckled under. I'm not, it's the opposite of saying, it was morally impressive precisely because it was morally humble. And that should be the context for my account of my first tete-a-tete with him. I remember that when he won the Nobel Prize, Bob and I both said, pardon the expression, "Oh, because we had a series of appointments we were supposed to meet, and one time Bob couldn't make it at the last minute, another time I couldn't make it at the last minute. Then we thought, now he's only good enough for us if he's won the prize. So we were shy to get in touch with him. But I think he finally initiated the contact. And when I went over his house, in the context of all that, he described to me what was going on in Poland after the Nobel Prize. The government, the first sign he was being rehabilitated was in the official encyclopedia of Polish literature. He was denounced not by name, but alluded to clearly as one of a group of writers of no importance. That was the thaw. So in that context, he then showed me, his brother had sent him a clipping from the newspaper in Warsaw that very carefully put together official government edition of innocuous poems, people were waiting around a square in a line, like for the opening of a very important movie or art show. And he laughed at that. And then he showed me a cartoon from a Polish newspaper. It was a series of panels, and in one panel, a guy is walking along reading a book, and there's a thug with a knife behind him, and then you see the guy has been stabbed and he's bleeding, and the thug has left the knife in him. And then the thug is walking along with the book, it says Milosz on it. And he was not without amour-propre or egotism, but this, I think, was partly just a way of laughing at the phenomenon of not having a crown and of having a crown. That it was real, it was part of the world, and it was also unreal. That it was all like icing on a cake. It was frosting. It had no nourishment. It had no real reality to it whatsoever. One of my favorite examples of that principle is that when our then editor Dan Halpern came out to Berkeley, just a year before the Nobel, Daniel Halpern and Czesław Miłosz gave a poetry reading together. And it was attended, this is a campus where the man had been teaching for 20 years or so. It was attended by 7 or 8 people. And the general feeling was most of them were there for Daniel Halpern. Then a year later, the official award that sometimes goes to mediocrities was attached to him. And the big auditorium in Wheeler Hall overflowed. They had to have speakers outside. And I don't think Czesław made the joke, but potentially you could say it's amazing how much better his poetry got in the course of that year.
When I'm a little bit younger than you guys, and when I
you know how to hurt.
Yeah, I do. But I found it somewhat revelatory when I first started to read about how lonely he was in California. Because reading his poems and reading his own prose, one doesn't get this impression. One gets an impression of someone who's excited by and in love with the light of Northern California, with Robinson Jeffers, with the nature of Northern California. The film that we just saw brings out very well how sad and lonely he was, how detached he was from people, how much he wanted contact. You guys, of course, provided a lot of that contact. In a very recent wonderful biography in Polish, unfortunately it's only available in Polish, by Andrzej Frnaszek, there is mentioned that there's a note in there. In fact, it's very detailed, and he includes almost all of your personal anecdotes about Miłosz at one point or another. Toward the end, he says that for most of Miłosz's Northern California career, the 2 keywords would have been wilderness and emptiness. That this was what he was dealing with all the time. And I'm wondering if that ever came out in other ways in your interactions. I actually wanted to begin with Bogdana and ask about his meeting with Zbigniew Herbert in 1968 at your home, if you're willing to talk about that.
Sure. Yeah. It's a little bit of a difficult topic. It turns out that my life and my career, in a way, were caught between 2 great Polish poets, Zbigniew Herbert and Czesław Miłosz. Zbigniew Herbert, whom I translated and with whom I was friends and also wrote a lot about, and Miłosz, who was my professor and also a friend. Well, it was 1968, summer. If I recall, July, beginning of July. Herbert was traveling through the country, this country, US, as a guest of the State Department. He got a grant, and then as he went through the southern part of the States, he eventually came to Berkeley and stayed at the Miłosz's He knew Milosz and was a close friend of Milosz. They met for the first time in Paris in the 50s, when Milosz was still living in France. Milosz arranged an evening of poetry reading for Herbert in his own tiny living room. And there were many students and colleagues, especially from the Slavic department. And my husband John and me, we were invited too. We sat on the floor and Herbert read his poems. We already, with John, read some of his poems and Milosz's translations of his poems before, but the reading by Herbert that evening made a tremendous impression on us. Herbert had also a beautiful, deep, low voice and was a very good reader of his poetry. So the following day, I called the Miloshes and invited them and Herbert to our house for dinner in a couple of days. There was also another couple present at that dinner. It was the Polish professor of sociology, Alexander Gela, and his wife, a painter, Teresa Mellerowicz Gela. Both of them were Herbert's friends from Warsaw, and he wanted to see them. Well, the evening started wonderfully. We had I remember, I prepared my specialty, a French bouillabaisse. It was very spicy with lots of saffron. So we drank a lot, all of us, more or less, all of us. And everything was just great as long as we sat in the dining room at the table. But then we got up and passed into the living room, and almost right away as we sat down, Herbert almost got up and started accusing Milosz in very harsh terms, an even harsher tone of voice, about Milosz's non-participation in the underground during the German occupation, during the World War II, and also about Milosz's criticisms after the war of the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. Milosz didn't say a word. He sat on the couch and just didn't say a word. There was also another little detail. Herbert accused Milosz of using a Lithuanian passport during the war to protect himself, and at the same time getting some help from the underground, as so many writers during the war did. Although that was a gossip, untrue gossip, Milosz didn't say a word to that either. His wife, Janka, several times asked him to react, to say something, but Milosz wouldn't. It lasted until about 3 o'clock at night, and at that time, Milosz's wife, Janka, got up and said, "We are going home, but he's not coming with us." So my husband went to Grizzly Peak, picked up Herbert's luggage, and for the rest of his stay, Herbert stayed with us. The next morning, Herbert said, "It seems I talked nonsense." And he called Milosz. But Milosz's wife answered the phone and said that he is not available. So he never met Milosz, never talked to him during that stay. Well, this has become a kind of cause célèbre in Polish literature, a quarrel of two greatest Polish poets, very much compared to a quarrel that happened in the 19th century between then two greatest Polish Romantic poets, Mickiewicz and Słowacki. But it is, until today, for that matter, known in a kind of false version. And the false version was created by Herbert himself, considerably later. In 1994, Herbert gave an interview to a Polish right-wing paper, Tygodnik Solidarność, in which he accused Milosz of provoking him by saying, supposedly when he was sober, Milosz was sober, that Poland should be the 17th Republic of the Soviet Union. Well, Milosz never said that. And there was not a word about that at the evening in our house. This was Herbert's creation, invention, possibly because he needed some excuse and didn't feel very happy. We have seen Herbert many times after that evening, since we became his translators. And there was not a single time from 1968 until his death that during our meetings, Herbert would not always, after sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes half an hour, sometimes an hour, end up talking about Milosz in that evening. It became an obsession. It, of course, hurt Milosz very much. He did not want to talk about it. We never talked about it again. It was, there were some journalists, we with my husband never talked about that evening for 20 years until Herbert started talking about it, and that's how it became known. Nor did Mr. and Mrs. Geller talk about it. There is now, in the 90s, I was asked by many, especially after Herbert's death or around Herbert's sickness, many well-known journalists wanted to interview me about it. I refused each time. But I did something, and it is, my story of the evening is available in the Museum of Literature of Adam Mickiewicz in Warsaw. And in Miłosz's apartment in Krakow, Miłosz's brother, whom I met through Miłosz in Warsaw, Andrzej Milosz, asked me one day during one of my trips to Poland in the 90s, could I come to his place and make a recording about this evening? So I did it. I even had to sign afterwards that these are my very words, and yes, this is the truth and only truth, which I did. There was then, and I forget now the year, there was a movie made in Poland about Herbert. I think Citizen Herbert, Obywatel Herbert, in which Herbert attacks Miłosz viciously, going back to this idea of Poland being the 17th Republic of the Soviet Union. And that affected, it seems Miłosz almost had a heart attack when he watched that on the TV in his Krakow apartment. So at that point, his brother thought of publishing what was this recording. And he called me here, and I said, yes, fine, but please send me your transcription. And both Miłosz and me refused the publication because the brother, with best intentions, instead of just transcribing the facts and the words simply of what has happened, every sentence was accompanied by a page of commentary. And that really was another distortion. So there is a faithful description of this evening in the biography by Andrzej Franaszek. He used exactly, he listened to that recording. I am very pleased that he did not highlight it, because this unfortunate encounter between the two poets has become really a kind of not just a literary event, but more of a political event, used both by the political left and especially by the political right in the most disgusting way. So I guess that's all.
I'm trying to think of an analogy for the Americans here, and it would, the political right that around the time of Czeslav's death was using would be the equivalent of Fox News. So it would be as if Robert Lowell was collaborating with Fox News to blacken the reputation of Elizabeth Bishop. Something like that would be. So it doesn't quite work, but it's something like that. The relationship to Herbert, a thing to understand about it is it's almost the first thing Czeslaw did when he got to Berkeley was to begin, say a word about that too, because he was an undergraduate in legal studies. And someone asked him why he didn't do Polish literature, and he said in those days you only studied Polish literature if you were going to be a school teacher, and only women were school teachers. So if you did the liberal arts, you did law studies. And then he worked in radio for many years, his first job writing script. He always used to refer to the pieces of paper he was working on as scripts. And during the war, the idea of becoming a laborer was not a new thing. That was what he did during the occupation. He worked as a teamster in Warsaw during the years of the occupation. Anyway, in those years, so he arrived in Berkeley. He had no academic training to be a professor. He just had read passionately like a writer. And one of the first things he did was create this book, Post-war Polish Poetry, published by Penguin, had enormous effect, and then a volume of Herbert. So he 68. And while it's true that he was lonely, he was a warrior and a worker. And in those 20 years, he maybe wrote 30 books, including some of the greatest poetry in a European language in the second half of the 20th century, plus really interesting prose books, plus he was translating Polish literature into English, and he was also doing some terrific translations of American literature into Polish. So, and he was raising a family, and he had a full-time job as a professor. When there was no anthology, no textbook of Polish literature in English, Czesław hired a stenographer and dictated a history of Polish literature over a couple of months period. I think he did it. By itself, an amazing accomplishment. And Herbert passed through, Alexander Watt passed through. He had an intensely busy, active literary life in those years. I'm sure when he was by himself and not working, he felt lonely, and he's written about it very movingly. But mainly what he was doing was working.
Could I add something to that about he had a very strong positivist side, and this idea of a work discipline that overcame any personal problems or defects was something that was so built in that was very, very hard to match. But I wanted to say a couple of things about the history of Polish literature. One of the things that he would always share with me was how few of his books were selling. So he would show me, for example, that there were maybe 7 histories of Polish literature that were sold one year, and they were all bought by libraries. And he'd say, look, the Polonia is not reading, they're not buying these books. And then when Bells in Winter, he was trying to get different university presses interested in publishing it, and nobody would do it. He would say, look, Nobody's interested. And I think what that taught me was, again, that idea of private obligations, that you stuck with it. And the irony that that book, Bells in Winter, turned out to be one of the best-selling small books of poetry is a tribute to Echo Press, the little press that then issued it so beautifully. One other thing that I wanted to mention was that, two things. One, that he would ask students to work on translation projects. It had nothing to do with being a particularly, I think, outstanding student. He could see intelligence in embryonic forms, I think, sometimes, and so would engage students. But it was a way for him to work with young people on something that really mattered to him. And I think that any of us who worked with him on a specific project are so marked by that project and a big leap in a certain kind of awareness. The other thing I wanted to mention is Ivar Ivask, the Estonian editor of World Literature Today, because Milosz was the recipient of the Neustadt Award before he got the Nobel Prize. And that was really, there was a whole volume of World Literature Today that was devoted to Milosz, and it included a chronology, it included the latest poems, it included translations of literary criticism. And he was extremely buoyed by that that volume of literature, especially by someone from the Baltic states, because when I was thinking about this talk, Made in America, I really thought it should have been called Made in Lithuania, in the broadest sense of that word, because he carried around Lithuania and a kind of a Baltic aesthetic and ethos in him that got him through some of these harder times. And so I agree with Bob that because of the way he worked, the work was a great consolation. Just as nature, I don't care what he says about nature, nature was a great consolation to him. When he starts talking about nature, I don't take all of it literally, because I think his intellect was at war with the way that nature made him feel, and I think that tension is evident in many of the poems. I think that's all for now.
I'm just thinking about the, I'd heard this story before, but never quite so genuinely. It's one of the saddest stories I've ever heard.
It was sad for us, yes.
And the sadness of it is an antidote to any sentimentality one might have about, say, talking about the intersection of personal lives and history, and what a great thing it is for poetry. Because in a way it's a story about mental illness or paranoia or about losing your grip, but it's expressed totally in historical terms. And for me, it's a story of sadness between friends and between people. And then it's expressed completely in these historical, political terms. And it brings back all those sayings about don't wish to be born in interesting times, and history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake, says Stephen Dedalus. It calls all of that up, but frankly, I'm just kind of, I have trouble getting my mind off that narrative. And Czesław's silence, it's just pretty heartbreaking.
You know, well, there are a few things. I can tell you that all four of us, the Gellas and my husband and me, we sat through that evening without a word. We were just terrified. We knew that this kind of, if that was to happen, it should have happened between the two of them. They knew each other for already 10 years. Herbert knew about what Milosz thought. It was about what Milosz wrote, among others, in The Captive Mind. Very openly. Yeah. Why then? Well, there was also something that we as hosts discovered too late, didn't know. that is that those poets like to drink, but they also got drunk in very different way. Herbert, and we've seen him many times since that evening drunk, always became very aggressive when drunk, unmistakably, absolutely every single time. Milosz, on the contrary, Milosz became this kind of cuddly bear when he drank. He was not always so sweet when he wasn't drunk, when he was sober. But when he drank, at least I also saw Milosz many times with fair amount of alcohol, and there was always this kind of other nature that came out, this kind of cuddliness, so to say, warmth, playfulness. I remember we celebrated his 80th birthday. I was on sabbatical and we were in Berkeley, actually in El Cerrito, and we invited Carol, his second wife, and him to our house. And after quite a few bourbons, Carol decided to tell us the story of their meeting and their kind of romance. And I remember Czesław sitting there and literally purring like a cat. Of course, he had all kinds of marvelous sounds that he made, very moving. The other sound would be if you praised his poem or something. There would be this little grunt there, very happy. So I will tell you another story about the poem. Well, in the 90s, when Milosz kind of spent half a year, more or less, in Berkeley and half a year in Kraków, and also by the time most of his Polish friends, he did have Polish friends in Berkeley, and especially the Mandels, but they died. He felt a great need of speaking Polish. So then when he was in Berkeley, during his Berkeley segment, he often called me just to speak Polish. And I remember it was March, I think, 2000, and I was sitting with John, my daughter Magda, and her fiancé. They were about to be married, and we were addressing the invitations, and the telephone rang. And there was Milosz, Czesław, and he said, I wrote an ode to the Pope. Well, so I said, can I have it? I knew exactly when the telephone rang and Czesław told me that he wrote something, I was supposed to read it immediately. So the poem was faxed. 10 minutes later, or 2 minutes later it arrived. 10 minutes later I was back on the phone because you had to be immediate. Reaction had to be immediate. So I praised, especially some lines were just wonderful, and I talk about it. But he was clearly very dissatisfied. He was there not making any happy grunts. So I knew there is something wrong, something I missed. Well, he said, what about that messianism? Just not a word about messianism, nothing. A very subtle allusion that Pope continues the Polish romantic messianic tradition, and that might be offensive. Actually, most Poles like the romantic messianic tradition, but Milosz hates that tradition, and he thought that might be an offense. So I said, I don't think it will be, and the poem, he wanted to know if he should change, but a week later I read the poem and it was in the original version. But the word is kind of, I was always moved that this, by then, Nobel Prize poet, read, celebrated, needed so much the praise, just what you said, Robert.
A related story. This takes us away both from wilderness and the incredible tragedies in Polish history that lay behind that argument and those accusations that Herbert made. But I remember one fall Cheslov had been in Europe this summer, including at some kind of seminar on the fate of Europe that the Vatican held. And we set to work on his most recent poems. And I think they were some of the early poems that appeared in Provinces. Anyway, we were working on them, and he said, "So what do you think of them?" Because you're just working technically. And I said, this is familiar material at this point, but you can't write anything that isn't interesting right now. And he said, "So you don't like them?" And he said, "The Pope liked them." I thought, well, okay.
I heard that same line.
On the subject
Talk about arguing by authority.
on the subject of wilderness, Lily and I were talking about his relationship to Robinson Jeffers and to California countryside. A word about that would be Lithuania, where I have not been, is, I gather, a land of lakes and forests. It's wet, and he was basically dismayed by the Mediterranean climate of California, and I thought just a word it's in English, not Polish, from that his account of this take. There's a thing in it that's terrifically moving to me. "I did not choose California. It was given to me. What has the wet north to say to this scorched emptiness, my beloved landscape? Grayish clay, dried up creek beds, hills the color of straw, and rocks assembled like Jurassic reptiles. For me, this is the spirit of the place, and the fog from the ocean creeping over it all, incubating the green and the arroyos and the prickly oak and the thistles. Where is it written that we deserve the earth for a bride, that we plunge in her deep, clear waters and swim, carried by her generous currents?" Little passage in a long poem, then proceeds back into Polish history. So this is him saying, so you're in this, who said you were going to get green springs and lush summers? And this is the work he was doing inside his head.
You know, the funny thing is he did have a choice in a way, because by the time he came to the United States, he had an offer from Indiana University, and writes in a couple of letters around that period to a couple of private letters that he thought he would have more visibility, basically, at Berkeley, that there would be it was a better university with a better, I'm not saying that, but in his perception, it was a place that was better suited to the kind of contact with people like yourselves that he wanted to have when he got here. And I'm wondering if that contact, that desire for praise and for someone to reach out toward him went the other way as well. I know that in 1972, Khaled mentioned that when Joseph Brodsky came to the United States, in fact to Ann Arbor, as a poet in residence, he already had something of a reputation. Anna Akhmatova has famously said after Brodsky's arrest that our little redhead has made quite a biography for himself. He comes to the United States, and Milosz immediately writes him a letter in Russian, which is the only, as far as I know, the only text we have by Milosz in Russian, in which he sort of reaches out to him, I suppose, just as a fellow exile. Yeah. And you have all four of you have had these extraordinary careers that have been touched by him, and I'm wondering if the praise also came to you from him, or that kind of guidance, or if it was mostly about working on his translations.
The two people of us who have been literally his students have both said what is not a surprise, I've heard it before, that he was a wonderful teacher, that he was a terrific teacher. And I'm sure I like praise at least as much as the next person, but my memory of those sessions with Bob and Czesław is full of the joy of this lonely activity of writing being a group activity and of learning how other minds think. And it was delicious. It was like playing music or sports is the only comparison I can think of in my own experience. You were doing this difficult thing, and you had the compliment, the praise was that these people were doing it with you. And I do include Bob in it. It was a great privilege for me to work with Bob and Czesław, and to think about how somebody else would do it. And well, you could stop. It doesn't have to be short sentence just because it's a short sentence in Polish, or you could this way. Or, well, if this is near the end of the line, then that can be near the end, beginning of the line there. It doesn't look as much like a repetition. Really like talking about, like pitchers talking about if you put your foot at an angle at the rubber, or it was highly technical. And in the work, it was your hands dirty with the material, with the paint or something. And that's the pleasure I associated with it. And this wanting to hear what you think about the new poem, which I experienced many times, and I did get the same line as Bob, which, what do you say? He says, what do you, I said, I'm not sure, blah, blah, whatever you say. He says, Pope liked this poem very much. That's part of that collegiality. It's part of his not saying, I'm the great man and you're a young guy who's helping me. It was part of that feeling, we're courting excellence together. We're just seeking excellence in this thing. And that's my good memory of all that.
Well, maybe because I was in my early 20s and young and really inexperienced in translation, my experiences were a little different, although I do remember this idea that it was a kind of a chess game. If you moved one piece, it really made a difference in the entire thing. But what I remember about it, because I've been thinking a lot about this, I was 21, he was 62, and now I'm that age. And what is it that I learned from him then that I can pass on to my students now, especially in regards with that translation? And he was very hard on, he was very hard on you because it was about the precision, it was about the good work, it was about making sure that the Polish lived in the new language, that it had a vitality. But at the same time, he saw translation, poetry as translation, and the art of defeat, that really the great creative act was to capture reality, to get it right. And so you would often fail at it, and that was something that I think was very useful. But certainly a very high standard. I like what Bob said about him in an interview, that sometimes we did have to lower the standard. And Bob Haas had said in an interview that it was more important for him to speak out, to say something important about what was going on in the world. There was that fidelity to the world, and it would be better to say something that you might be a little ashamed of than not to say anything at all, than to be silent. And those are the kinds of things that you picked up in working with him and sharpening your own powers of articulation. So one more memory that I have of going to a poetry reading, and again, there were 6 or 7 people in a church, and there was another poet reading there too, and somebody came out at the end, this is in Berkeley, and handed the other man a check, and handed Czesław a check. And I remember the other man gave it back and said, here, give it to, for the community at large. And Czesław didn't do that. And I remembered thinking, wow, does he really need, $25 or whatever it was? And I asked him about it later. I said, why did you take that money for reading? I was so used to doing this for free. And he said, this is work. This is work for society. This is good, solid work. and you need to be paid for it. You know, it was something that was really concrete.
We don't have a lot of time left, and I kind of wanted to move on chronologically a bit to this explosion of translation and publishing that happens starting in the 70s, and I have a shameless plug for the publishing operation, Michigan Slavic Publications here, because the first representative selection of Miłosz's work in Polish to be published in North America was published here in 1976, and I brought a copy, which, by the way, is still, I think it's still the first printing is still available. We have it in our warehouse. It became known in Poland as the Green Book. It's just the Green Book, because people would actually smuggle this back before his work was generally available. But then Emperor of the Earth, the essays, some of which were translated, some of which were actually written by him in English. And I was reading not that long ago in his letters to Thomas Merton, where he writes in 1960 or thereabouts that he's completely incapable of translating his own poems. He says he could translate other people's poems, but not his own. With your help, something changed in him that made him more interested in no longer just promoting the work of other poets in North America to North American students, but really engaging with the life of poetry in North America and thinking, sort of making himself into an American poet. And what did that look like? What changed for him?
Well, I don't think I witnessed that change, and I think there are a bunch of ways in which he remained adamantly a Polish poet. He wrote one poem in English in his life, the poem to Raja Rao. And I think that the moment when he approached me to read the poems in English, when he read the poems in Polish, was also partly that moment. So, I mean, it's a complicated subject, obviously, but boy, was he a Polish poet to the end.
I couldn't agree more. That I think of that poem, My Faithful Mother Tongue. It's a poem addressed to Polish, where he talks about putting little paints. It's like a ritual. It's like an altar. It's a work of art. It's little bits of colored liquid, but it's also like an altar. And there's a kind of a bitterness in it, too. He says, oh, this country, huh? And yes. This is my... It's like a family, you know, it's a very disastrous family, this language, but it's my family. And I think also of his poem to, I never felt I was talking to an American poet when I talked to him about poetry. If I mentioned Wallace Stevens, I think his eyes glazed over. He was interested in Jeffers. I think Stevens, he may have a little lip service to Frost for informal grounds, but William Carlos.
Like the Elizabethans.
Yeah, like the Elizabethans. He translated a lot of Stevens early, and there's a kind of polemic with Stevens.
I was going to encourage you to talk about it, or somebody. There's that poem to Robinson Jeffers, where Robinson Jeffers, who I think it says how little Czesław was an American poet, that the quintessential American poet for him was Robinson Jeffers, is my impression. And in the poem to Jeffers, he looks at Jeffers the way I imagine a lot of Polish literature looks east and west. You know, we're so sensitive and you're so insensitive in a way. And he says, when we look up at the sky, the sun has a face, it's beaming down at us, and the moon looks down at us. But you Scots-Irish guy there in Carmel, you just see the vicious sun. And for me, it's a legitimate failure or misapprehension of what American poetry is. I don't think Czesław had a full, rounded idea of American poetry or culture, and I think that helped him be a greater Polish poet. It was partly deliberate. That poem to Raja Rao, I have often thought there are deliberate awkwardnesses in it. It's deliberately written in an English less good than Czesław could have written. It begins with something, he says, that ailment, and you think that most people writing in English would say this ailment. And it's consciously, possibly, or unconsciously, you can tell he's not going to write poems in English. My slogan when I worked with Bob and Czesław was that we should not be called translators. These people are translators. Bob and I were consultants in English idiom and rhythm.
True.
That is precisely what we did, and it was what he wanted and was very useful to him.
Yeah. Well, with this and that, me being not the only non-native speaker, we are not that aware of it, of this difference as non-native speakers. So I'm not sure it was on purpose by Czesław. But if I could add a little word here, no, he remained a Polish poet. Continued, even though he was born in Lithuania, lived shortly in Poland, and then in France and in this country. Yes, he was a poet of the Polish tongue. And as I say, when he makes an invocation, unlike the great Polish poet Mickiewicz to Poland, he doesn't make an invocation to Poland and to Lithuania. He makes it to the Polish language, my native mother tongue. And that's very important. But as a translator, there is here, I think, a very interesting switch in Milosz. Because when Milosz starts by, of course, he translates first during the 40s, and he translates because he is at that time looking for a new poetic idiom to express, actually, to be able to write about the new reality, too. That's when he reaches to Anglo-Saxon poetry, English and American poetry.
Is that when he did Eliot?
Yes, that's when he did Eliot. He actually prepared a whole anthology of English poetry, not just contemporary, but that has never been published. But he, at that time, looks to English poetry. Actually, he says something very interesting, that in order to be a poet today, you have to know English language. Because as advanced technical countries, England and America have created a new language how to deal with the new situation of men in the world. But then when he translates, when he comes to this country, when he starts to translate from Polish into English, the anthology of post-war Polish poetry, Herbert, Świerszczyńska, Watt, he is doing that in a polemical way with what he sees not only American poetry, but Western poetry. It is look how it should be. And he kind of criticizes very much, especially what he perceives as nihilism of the Western literature. And then something happens after Nobel Prize. So he writes in a polemical way, he translates to show how really great poetry in our century, in our time should be, right? Personal, but at the same time collective, understanding the collectivity and identifying with it. And then after Nobel Prize, after you, Robert, called him an American poet, right?
No.
Yes, you did.
That was, that gets into another polemical area. Read it, because that's about American culture. Walcott, Heaney,
Yes.
Brodsky, Milosz were appointed American poets.
Right.
And I'm guessing that's the context in which I said that. They were not really American poets, but for the Americans, they were made into American poets.
But I heard you in Claremont McKinnock
I see.
conference. You said that. I quote you.
Okay.
So, anyway.
What are you going to believe, your own ears or what I say?
That is a hard choice.
Well, there's another way in which you might situate this. Is actually something that Bob says in the film, is that American poets of your generation reached to Milosz and
Yes.
Herbert to get away from O'Hara, and American poets of my generation reached to O'Hara to get away from Milosz and Herbert.
Whatever Bogdana says, in my mind, I would say that as a way of describing the appropriation of
that's-
these poets, which is also, I can't really analyze. There's something in American culture where guilt about an imperium makes us not want to recognize our own poets.
Guilt about?
The imperium, the domination of American film, music, military, money. That's a guess. I can't really analyze it, but I know there was that feeling that it's much easier to praise a West Indian or an Irishman or a Pole or anything other than an American. And that was part of American culture for certain decades. And these poets were sort of incidental factors in that process. So I suspect that I had something like that in mind, and that it was that kind of sullenness that I said that, but whatever.
But he was also by then translated. He had the Nobel Prize. He was a recognized a poet, really
yeah.
here, very
Certainly.
much present in American poetry, and he felt it. So his attitude changes when he publishes the Book of Luminous Things, the anthology. He is no longer outside of this. He is kind of espousing not only the world literature as opposed to just Polish literature. He's also addressing like an older master, so to say, or what he called himself in relation to the Polish literature. The Polish word is gospodarz polskiej literatury. Manager, that's a wrong word, but Lord of Polish literature, something like that. Between a humble manager and a lord, it's somewhere there. He is talking about the state of world literature, and that he wants to be that kind of master for that literature as well. And that includes, first and foremost, American literature. So he changes. He changes, of course, the crucial moment is the Nobel Prize. He is no longer an outsider. He's an insider now. He can be now a guide and a master, not only for the Poles, which he has been, but also for Americans. So I think there is, you have something to do with that. Yes. It's wonderful. It's moving, I think.
I could go on with this forever.
I don't like that anthology.
Oh, all right.
Among other things, that's a whole other topic.
Yeah, well, that's a different story we could talk.
But in a way, in the process that you're describing, in American terms, he became a kind of middlebrow. Middlebrow. To me, there's something disappointing in that book. And in a way, Bogdana has made an explanation available to me, because I think of the book as being, in a way, beneath the Milosz that I admire. So I've never thought it was a terrific book. I've always felt a little sorry for it. It always seemed slightly sad that he had this idea of, these are examples of poems of reality, and there's something not so hot about it to me. That's another large topic.
Yeah, but that's a different topic. Because
Yes. Where they're related is that in a Polish context, he would not make what I view as a kind of a false step that he made with that. And it was
he published it in Polish as well.
I understand that. I know. I know.
I could really go on all night doing this, but it's getting late, and we were thinking that maybe one or two people might have questions. There are microphones in the audience if there are questions for our guests.
I'm from Berkeley. I go back there all the time, so it was really, really cool to see that. And I was in Boston the last 3 years, so I've been hanging out there too. But a couple of things. How sad, the story about Herbert and Milosz. I mean, that story was the one you were telling of that evening. It's like a story of what happened in World War II to Europe. I thought. But I also wanted to know, there was this disjunction between this idea of relativism and absolute in the film. And I don't know his work that well, but I was wondering where does he place himself? I mean, as I'm a poet as well, and I understand the idea of being in the moment and really paying attention to the world you're in, and I think that's profound. But where does he lie in a political, poetic way in regard to this relativism versus absolute? I mean, because both things are happening in his work as well as in that film, and I wanted to know what people thought about that, because there was no conclusion.
Between relativism and what was the second term?
And absolutism.
Well, absolutism is a curious term for it. The answer, as with almost every other question, in my view, that you'd put to his work is that he felt both ways about it, that he was, and he said once that, quoting Simone Weil, that the best art did not resolve contradictions, it intensified them. And I think she said that contradiction was the lever of transcendence. And I think that in his best work, and I think there's a certain amount of complacent or pious work, gestures toward pieties of various loyalties that he had, in which certain of these issues seem resolved, that in his best work, he just made them agonizing. The difference between those two things. So there are poems written from the point of view of his experience as a young man, suddenly realizing that all the morality of the adult world is totally made up and completely hypocritical. And there is, on the other hand, in him, a terror that goes very deep of what you're calling relativism, of the idea that there is no foundation on which to, no place from which to say what evil is, no place from which to say, and that involved choices he made in his personal life and that are right at the heart of the captive mind. He said, in the film, because I'm a fatalist, I joined the Polish communist government, which is, and there are poems connected to this issue about Linnaeus and Darwin, because he thought, and as he talks about in the Nobel lectures, that once the world of brilliant nouns, the Linnaean categories of being, collapsed, there was nothing left but verbs. There was nothing left but nature, which was raw action without consciousness and without morality. And that meant all those people who got shipped off to Lithuania because they had a bourgeois, to Siberia because they had a bourgeois understanding of the land problem and were killed in those camps. That's the wheel of history, Robert's Wheel of Fortune in his poems, just crushing people. And what you should do is stand where you need to stand to survive. And this, in turn, was connected to his polemic with Polish Romanticism and to that argument with Herbert. That is to say, he would say about Polish literature, talking to me once about black literature, he said, black literature is like Polish literature. American blacks can't write about a tree, they have to write about a tree and racism. Poles can only write about Polish trees. If it's a tree, it's a Polish tree. And until we can escape the years of domination that produced that kind of literature, and it produced martyrdoms, accusing Milosz of not being involved in the Home Army and going out heroically into the streets and throwing Molotov cocktails at tanks. 250,000 people were killed in 10 days that way. And he thought it was stupid. And one of the things Captive Mind is about is the way that his generation, kind of inventing these existentialist tragic gestures, sent the young out to die. they weren't cunning. They didn't calculate the odds, and the Polish literature had taught them not to. So, and he made a series of choices in his life. The choice not to be part of the Home Army, the choice to join the communist government, and then when he couldn't swallow it, to pull back from it. And so he, in one hand, thought himself as a warrior for the possibility of a ground from which you could make moral judgments or everything was lost. And on the other hand, he had this immense appetite and erotic life and love of the world and love of nature. And so he had this intellectual disapproval of process and a kind of natural, enormous appetite. One of his poems begins in the English translation. It's, "My Lord, I loved strawberry jam and the dark sweetness of a woman's body. Forgive me for that." And there's another poem in which he says, when Jesus came by, I was in one of the side alleys in Jerusalem because there was somebody cooking fresh goat meat. So, how to say, gather this together, all of this, the appetite for the world and the fear of not having any place to judge from which those people could be forgiven, issued in a poetry that was obsessed with saying the world, saying what it was and what its possibilities were. And for all I was thinking about why I felt so disturbed by that movie, and I thought that it conveyed him, but it didn't convey what a great poet he was. And it didn't convey what a great poet he was because it didn't go into, and there's no way to convey it except to immerse yourself in the poetry. And it's a poetry of a person absolutely tormented by the question you just asked, and who doesn't let himself off the hook on either side in his best poems.
He told me once that all of his problems stem from the fact that he can't make up his mind. He couldn't make up his mind. He said that. Could I add just one thing? Go ahead and ask your question. I was just going to add one thing. In a letter that he wrote to me, it was the last letter that he wrote to me, he said, because his books became the springboard for a kind of nature literacy and interest in sort of multiple disciplines, a historical sense, all these different things that you've been hearing about. And I've been working with college students, and he wrote to me and he said, I live in the Great Central Valley of California and consider myself a bioregionalist, which is just someone who's interested in everything that's alive in that part of the world. And he said, your assimilation of the Central Valley, I had been doing a lot of different kinds of things there, your assimilation of the Central Valley, I consider one of my greatest contributions. And I had been thinking, what was he trying to say? Was it just, a kindness, just a conciliatory remark? But I think what he said was he had a fear of provincialism, Polish provincialism. And I think what he was saying was that he had given me tools that I could use, cognitive tools that I could use to understand another place. And that was a great success to him, that coming out of Lithuania with a certain ethos at the core of his poetry, somebody else was able to understand that and translate that into tools to know the reality they were given. And I think that's what he considered a great success of his poetry.
Well, I think my real question might be, can we continue in this vein? Because I'm very interested in what you just said, Robert Haas, about not feeling that the film really fully conveyed Milosz as a poet. And I would question also maybe Nora as a teacher, which I think Lillian and Bogdana have talked about a little bit. But I guess I'm curious, so you used the word warrior a few times, and Lillian Valley, you told that great story about him keeping the money from the reading and talking about the poet as worker and that work as having real value. So I guess I just wondered if you could continue to talk about that and connect it back a little bit to his sort of standing, to being in the U.S., to standing outside of the kind of conventional organizations or ways of thinking about things that would have been perhaps, that would have made him famous much earlier in his career, I guess.
I don't understand. He was famous very early in his career, only not in this country. But in Poland, before the war, he won an award for as best young poet. He was, after the war, certainly recognized very quickly as a major
Right.
poet. So
Sorry,
he
I guess
was
famous might
actually
not be the right
famous.
word. I'm thinking of, you talk about that long period of him feeling as though he hadn't made it after all.
Well, he came to a country with a different language, and his poetry was in a, well, let's say, I don't know, a language not spoken by many non-Poles. So therefore,
It does happen.
He was the
therefore
golden
he
boy.
felt he was just, and because of his asking for political asylum, he was immediately on a blacklist in Poland. Therefore, he lost his Polish audience and didn't gain any other audience because he was living in foreign countries, France and this country. But I think that one of his kind of senses of disappointment, bitterness even, because I would argue there was bitterness about that precisely, not having an audience, not having his poems read by people, was because he already experienced fame, because he already knew what it means to be a well-read poet, a famous poet, to be a leader in your country, to be looked up to. And suddenly he changes places and he's nobody. He's an author of The Captive Mind. Great as this book is, this is not what he felt was his identity. So I think that was kind of that would be for anyone, I think, a problem, because all of a sudden, what's your identity really even? I don't know if I could answer the rest of your question, because I am not sure how it connected the first part and the second.
One of the things that gets left out of this narrative is France. He was, I gather, when he, by the end of the war, the golden boy of Polish poetry. He was the most famous young Polish poet. He came from Lithuania, where Mickiewicz and Słowacki had come from. He belonged to the old gentry that produced the landlord literature of Poland. He had everything going for him. He joined the party, which didn't join the party, joined the government, but that meant things that, like, you were given a cabana on the Baltic Sea as a summer place. His mother stayed there for a while and taught in one of the village schools after the war. And he was a diplomat in Paris, and Poles looked to Paris for judgment in the way that Americans looked to New York. It was the literary capital of the world, and Mickiewicz had been in exile there. Czesław went there. There was a photograph I saw of Aragon and Éluard, the two most famous French poets at the time, and Neruda and Milosz, four handsome young guys, all in tweed coats with beautiful knit ties of the period, blowing in the wind, smoking gauloises on Pont Neuf. And Czesław said, when I pointed at it and shook my head and smiled, nobody did badly being a communist in Paris in 1950. And when he had translated Neruda's poems, Neruda had translated his poems, and when he defected, wrote the one-page essay, Nay, No, in Cultura, I guess it was, the French Communist Party assigned Neruda to write the denunciation of Milosz, which he did. And I haven't read this, but I'm told that not long after, a story appeared by a novella or a story by a Polish writer called The Writer Who Disappeared. Renata told me this story, and Czesław later meeting the guy, but a story was published about a vain, petted, pampered Polish writer who vainly pretended to go into exile, imitating Mickiewicz, and was a mediocre talent and was completely forgotten. And and in Paris, because he had defected, he no longer had access to the intellectual circles of Sartre and de Beauvoir. So his only friend among the two were Lucien Goldman and Albert Camus, the two who were anti-Stalinists. But he had no friends in France, and he was trying to make a life, 10 years, his attitude toward money. He was trying to spent 10 years making a living as a freelance writer, and was not just persona non grata, but was despised by a good deal of the European left because of his situation. And he wrote 2 or 3 of these remarkable prose books and some of the poems, and then landing on the shores in Berkeley with the calculation that if he was ever going to claw his way back, that it would be a good spot to do it from. He was 3 times removed from anything like connections to literary circles, except the small group of writers at Kultura. His relationship to Gombrowicz by mail, I guess, during those years, a handful of people. And he tenaciously hung on and made his art, and he made his art out of these intense preoccupations that we thought of. His ambivalence about the erotic nature of life, his longing for God or for something like that. How do you imagine after World War II that a God created this? Did the camps, did all of that. It led him to, Lillian was talking about, to a fascination with Manichaean theology. And the other underlayer of that, the joke about the dog being the devil, he was a deeply superstitious person. I think he believed that. He did believe that. He grew up in this. He grew up in the part of Lithuania that he lived in was the last place in Europe to be converted to Christianity. There were still people worshiping bears 100 years before he was born in that part of the world. So as the novel, the Issa Valley gets, so there are so many levels of torment, and the thing that he was able to do in his work that poets like that with him is that he found every part of himself to throw at that material in the course of his life as a writer.
I think this is a fast question. I've spent a lot of time living in the Bay Area, and I enjoyed seeing various places that I know in the film. And I wondered if you could suggest a place or two that he enjoyed that I could think about when I go back there.
The cafe at Chez Penis upstairs. And, another thing about Czesław was that when you went to dinner with him, everybody would order their meal. It would arrive. You would toast each other, and Czesław would have finished. Looking astonished, where did it go? I've eaten it already. So he loved that. He walked on Grizzly Peak and the eucalyptus groves up there. He loved that. He loved the Napa Valley and its wineries. He didn't like the Marin Coast, which I love. Can you think, Robert, of Lillian?
Chez Penis is the best answer.
Yeah.
Upstairs.
He liked to stroll. Every morning he would walk, stroll. Livermore Laboratory was one of the views there, too.
The library, it's one of the, like the Michigan Library, it's one of the great libraries of the world. And somehow after the war, it got all the German military maps of Eastern Europe. And what Czeslaw loved to go in, he loved to go into the library and bury himself in that place and find the German artillery ordnance maps of his grandparents' house. Pour through those maps, and this is maybe ending with his words as a portrait of him, about to go in to the up the marble steps of Doe Library in Berkeley. An old man, he was going to live for another 20 years almost. An old man, contemptuous, black-hearted, amazed that he was 20 a short time ago, speaks, though he would rather understand than speak. He loved and desired, but it turned out badly. This is the Milosz who felt that he had failed in the worldly project anyway. He pursued and almost captured, but the world was faster than he was, and now he sees the illusion. In his dreams, he's running through a dark garden. His grandfather is there, but the pear tree isn't where it should be, and the little gate opens to a breaking wave. Inexorable earth, irrevocable law, the light unyielding. Now he is climbing the marble steps of the library, and the blossoming orange trees are fragrant, and he hears for a while the chew of birds, but the heavy doors are already closing, behind which he will stay for a very long time in air that does not know winter or spring, in the fluorescence without light, in a fluorescence without mornings and without sunsets. The coffers of the ceiling in the old library reading room imitate a forest vault. He passes through halls of mirrors, and the faces loom up and dissolve, just as Barbara, the princess in the Polish fairy tale, appeared. I added that phrase to explain to you who Barbara was. Just as Barbara, the princess, appeared to the king when a black mage had conjured her, and all around him voices were intoning. So many he could listen for centuries, because he wanted once to understand his poor life. Czeslaw Milosz.